We're going to be talking to a criminal and family lawyer about the 8-passenger situation. He's got his legal skills to break down exactly what's going on here. So let's get into it. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are joined by a special guest, Dmitry, who's a lawyer who practices family and criminal law. And he's the perfect person to break down the 8-passenger situation with us. So how are you doing, Dmitry?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, first off, how did you come across this case? Because 8-Passengers has been on YouTube for quite some time, and they've actually cease and desisted me like 2 years ago. So I'm surprised at how this case has reached people, outside of the internet. And how did you stumble across the situation?
Well, I typically just, in my capacity as a professor in New York, I do a lot of commentary on legal cases. And so I do work into looking into what's out there, what's in the press, what's being reported on. And this was one of the cases that caught my attention just recently.
Cool. So Dmitry does have a YouTube channel where he does some commentary. We will link it below, so definitely go and check him out. But what are your first reactions to seeing a family channel mother, charged with these child abuse crimes?
So what you said is absolutely right. The charges are just charges, right? They're not admissions of guilt. They're not evidence of guilt. They're not really evidence of anything. We are right now in the initial stages of this case. What matters next is what happens in terms of the evidence, the discovery, as they call it, what comes out as the case moves on and moves forward. And that will really set the tone for what will happen here. Beyond that, it's tough to know what conduct is really at play that is being alleged.
So we've got Ruby and Jody. I believe they're still in jail. Do you know?
I don't know. And in every state, the bail laws are different. I don't know how it works in Utah, but in these kinds of cases, oftentimes when you have alleged behavior that is violent or otherwise serious, bail is denied, at least on some level, or it's set very high. So it wouldn't surprise me.
So when it comes to the discovery phase, I personally am thinking a lot of like YouTube channels, social media people, they get wrapped up in these messy, criminal situations, and sometimes it's a lot of bluff. But we've heard the police, call, and we've heard that these children had duct tape around their wrists, on their ankles, they had lacerations. So when we go into this discovery phase, it's going to be, I guess, examining the children's condition and, I guess, speaking to doctors and collecting the evidence that these 2 kids were in fact abused.
Absolutely. Don't forget, the presumption of innocence applies, right? So the burden to prove guilt falls on the prosecution here. The prosecution will be putting forward the evidence that will convict these people if they are to be convicted at some point. So it's one thing to read the probable cause affidavit, to read the complaint, even in cases where defendants are indicted, right? These things mean very little. What's important is what comes out at a trial, if there is a trial at some point down the line, because that is when the defense can cross-examine and really pick away at some of the possible defenses and consistencies, so on and so forth.
So when it comes to the situation, I cover a lot of domestic violence cases and such on my channel. And usually it's like another party kind of, charging someone else with this problem. Here we've got minors. So is it going to be the state who's pursuing Ruby and Jody? There's not going to be a chance where these charges are just dropped because, the children want to drop them.
Well, in every criminal case, it's the government going against the defendant, right? It's on the federal level, the United States of America. On the state level, the people of the state of whatever. If you're in a municipality, in a locality, that may vary as well. So in a criminal case, it's always the government, right? Some subsidiary, let's say, of the government. If you have other cases, it may be the actual parties. When you have kids, government agencies take those roles over, often Child Protective Services, ACS, things like that. Again, these things vary depending on the state that you're in.
So Ruby is the mother of these children, but from our understanding, the children were in Jody's care. And that's, I'm assuming, where they could have been abused by Jody. I mean, if Ruby is kind of innocent in the situation. So then I'm confused. One, why Ruby is being charged and not not Kevin, her husband? Because if they are both the parents of these children, I guess they're both responsible for putting them in Jody's care. Do you have any like inclination to why maybe Kevin wouldn't be wrapped up in this?
Well, when you deal with criminal cases, right, degree of intent is important, right? In order to charge somebody with a crime, oftentimes the way our system works is you have to prove not only the act, what they did, but also what they call the mens rea, what's in their head, right? And there are varying levels of intent or mens rea, right? There's negligence, there's knowledge, there's recklessness, right? So it depends on what the statute calls for, right? What the criminal statute under which they will be charged calls for. And it also depends on what you would hope the interest of justice serve, right? The interest of justice must look out not to convict these folks, but to serve justice. And perhaps if one party is in charge or one party is charged with less severe crimes, there's a reason for that because the investigators and the prosecutors have deemed that appropriate. And prosecutors have prosecutorial discretion, right? They make these decisions. And so that's who we are relying on at this point.
So, I'm not a lawyer. So when I see this, I'm like, okay, Ruby and Jody were charged with 2 counts of child abuse. Can you kind of explain like what these charges are and what they mean in your legal understanding?
Well, again, so the charges really, it depends on mens rea. It depends on the intent, right? Prosecutors will have to at some point prove that a certain degree of intent or knowledge or recklessness was met. And as a result of that, something resulted from the act of abuse, right? They're going to have to merge all of those elements together. But again, that will really depend on the evidence, right? Not the charges, not what's written in this probable cause affidavit that they seem to have in play. That's all important because that gives insight as to what the allegations are, but that's not important as to proving them guilty in a court of law.
So this probable cause affidavit, like what is this? Who created this and what evidence do we have in it? Because from what I've seen, like I've collected what we've seen on the internet as far as like the calls and the bookings, but do we have something that kind of explains exactly why they've been, and what's like written in there that kind of suggests that these 2 may be guilty?
So different states do it in different ways, right? But probable cause is kind of the uniform standard to arrest somebody for a crime, to charge somebody with a crime. And probable cause means very little, really. It's a very low standard. It means fair probability of criminal activity, right? So in order to meet the probable cause standard, as you do for arrest, for example, in this country, you have to show that, right? And different states do it different ways. Some states have documentation that investigators and prosecutors have to put forth called probable cause affidavits, right? Supporting documents where law enforcement agents under oath will complete an affidavit, file it with the court. And in that affidavit will be substantive factual allegations, right? What gave rise to the probable cause? So the probable cause affidavit is important because to some degree, it gives the prosecutor's side of the story, which is not controlling, is not governing, but it's important because you know what the prosecutors think happened, at least in this initial stage. Again, we're still at the beginning. It's important to keep that in mind.
So do we have access to this documentation?
So what will happen is, again, as time passes, prosecutors have a duty to disclose much of this evidence. In some states, like New York, for example, the rules have been expanded vastly to ensure that defense lawyers get everything that a prosecutor has. Different states do it different ways, again, but the discovery portion of the case will dictate that the defense has a right to see what the prosecutor's evidence is. And at that point, it'll be further into the public record and we'll be able to see that.
So I cover a variety of cases online, and sometimes we hit a roadblock because these cases involve minors, and there's protections around minors. So is there a chance that we're not going to see a lot of this documentation because the kids are involved?
Well, that's possible. That's possible. But in cases involving minors in general, right, every party, again, generally speaking, is interested in having the minors not participate actively in a criminal case, right? Because minors obviously are fragile. Obviously, they're emotionally undeveloped to some degree, right? Like all minors are. And so the last thing you want to do is subject them to this process. The last thing you want to do is put them on the witness stand. The last thing you want to do is let a lawyer cross-examine them, right? Because that'll add to trauma, and that may exacerbate real issues that may be underlying some of this stuff. And so in every case, that's the case. Now, depending on the age of the minors, there could be a question raised as to whether or not they are what they call competent to testify, right? Some minors are so small and underdeveloped, they can't testify, right? Because their testimony is so inherently unreliable. Then as they get older, their testimony is given more weight, right? And they're permitted to testify. And again, this is one of those things where different states have different rules. So all of those questions will come into play as this case moves further and further. We're only a few days in, so it's early.
And personally, I feel like I can't imagine these kids testifying, because the way that Ruby operates, it seems like she evokes a lot of fear in these children. So I can't imagine them having to sit in a room where her lawyers are berating them, and they have to they're going to feel inclined to comply to whatever would appease their mother. I mean, I think their mother has created a really toxic relationship within them, and just their ability to speak for themselves. So hopefully I don't want to see these minor children testify, but I do have a question, because we have Sherry, who's the oldest daughter, and she's been the most publicly outspoken about disconnecting from her parents. These charges don't necessarily involve Sherry, but she is part of the family. Do you think there's a way where she could go in and testify on behalf of those children, or is that kind of not allowed because she's not really involved in that direct criminal case?
So, you're getting into a very complex legal area, right? Having to do with what they call essentially character evidence. So when you have a witness that can testify as to a defendant's character, meaning that witness can't testify as to what happened in the case, but can testify as to other things, you get into real murky territory, because the law is interested in not having juries render verdicts based on somebody's character rather than the facts of the case, right? That makes sense. And so generally speaking, you can't testify that somebody is generally bad or generally scary or generally imposing, right? What you can do oftentimes is you can have somebody testify as to, let's say, pattern or intent, right? You have to connect it to some purpose, but the purpose can be, hey, get on the stand and tell us all these bad things about this person, because that will be inadmissible. There are rules at play that prevent that from coming out.
So maybe if Sherry has some eyewitness testimony to times she's seen these children being abused, opposed to her own interpretation of who Ruby is, if she actually witnessed some of the abuse, then maybe she could go up there and then testify and speak on their behalf.
But she could testify as to the pattern, right? At that point, the court would have to weigh whether her testimony is sufficiently important to allow the defendant to be prejudiced, right? The court does this balancing test really with any evidentiary issue, and this is one of them, where the court will decide whether or not the veracity of the evidence, right, the believability of the evidence, is worth hurting the defendant, right? Because if the evidence is evidence of a certain pattern, you really got to be careful before you bring that in, right? What you don't want is somebody testifying not about the facts of the case, but about the defendant in the case, and have a jury render a verdict as to that, right? Our laws are designed and our system is designed to prevent that from happening.
So we don't have all the details, but we've got a general idea of what condition these children were in. When it comes to cases like this, I mean, how do you think Ruby or Jody will be able to get themselves out of it? I mean, I feel like when you're accused of such a heinous crime, I just don't know how they're going to explain that away.
Well, we don't have a general idea of what happened here. We have a general idea of, at least we have a very general idea, I would say, of what the prosecuting lawyers think happened, right? And I'm not just doing this to talk like a lawyer, right? Because in every case, you have that, right? You have initial complaints, indictments, presentations to grand juries, and those look really bad. And then as time passes, certain facts come out, certain evidence comes out, and who knows what will happen here? Maybe it won't. Maybe this is that bad. You never know. But we just have to be careful before we say, well, how will X, Y, and Z person defend him or herself? Because the defense will largely depend on the offense, let's say, right? On what the evidence the government will put forth. These cases oftentimes are charged on reasonable doubt, right? Very few times are they charged. Criminal cases in general are defended on actual innocence, right? They're oftentimes defended on reasonable doubts, which basically reasonable doubt, which is a fancy way of saying that the lawyers will get up there and try to poke holes in this game. And as long as they can do that in a sound, ethical way, right, then the prosecution's case and the allegations that you're hearing will tend to go away and peel away little by little. So it's important not to jump to conclusions. That's what I will say, as it is in any criminal case this early on.
So Ruby is, I guess, considered these children's main caretaker. Do you think, because these are young kids, and I think our understanding is that they're safe with family right now, but what will the turnover of this case be? Because I mean, these kids need to have their legal guardian, or at least figure out who their legal guardian will be. Is this going to be something that we're going to see dragged out for year or years?
So that's interesting, right? It's a great question. The criminal process is designed to punish a defendant, right? It's designed to, if a defendant has committed a wrong under the criminal law, they are to be punished in some way, whether that be jail or something else is a different story. There are other courts in the system that are designed to deal with parental rights, right? Children's rights. And again, this is one of those things that vary state by state, right? There are things in place like family courts and other things of that nature that are designed to designate the relationship between a parent and a child and other family members. And typically these courts will handle proceedings such as abuse, such as adoption, such as paternity, such as child support, right? And so once this case is over, or perhaps even well before it's over, those other proceedings will get going as well, right? To see what happens with these kids, irrespective of whether or not there's an acquittal or a conviction or something else. Right. And again, I hate to keep kind of harping on this, but these charges can be dismissed tomorrow. Right. And then the whole dynamic changes. That doesn't often happen. But what I'm trying to say is, eyes wide open for these kind of things.
Are there like cases you've seen before where there is just one parent charged? Because I don't understand how like the business partner and the mother are charged, yet the father is just like, I mean, maybe later on he could be booked into some type of charge, but do you see any cases where there is just one parent who's being accused of abuse and the other one's just let free?
Well, yes, because it depends oftentimes, really, because it depends on the severity of the conduct, right? Criminal law isn't civil, right? In other words, it's harder to bunch people in, right? What you do is you evaluate people one at a time. And only because there's a similar familial relationship doesn't mean there's a similar level of criminal culpability. So you never know, right? You never know why investigators did this. And you're right, they can charge them down the line. But at this point, it must be such that they deem some people more involved criminally than others. That's all.
So this is kind of a bizarre question and definitely thinking ahead. But like from my understanding, looking into Jody has some really intense parenting skills that she likes to teach people, and some people believe that maybe Ruby got wrapped up into it, that she truly believes that her children are bad kids and Jody needs to reprimand them. And do you think, and this is again like kind of bizarre out there, so you probably won't really have an answer, but like if I just can imagine Jody going up there and almost like pleading like, or not Jody, I can see Ruby going up there and almost pleading like insanity, like she was brainwashed by Jody into believing that this was the right thing for her children. Even though she's fully aware of what they're going through, she truly believed that her kids were bad. I mean, even I believe Jody said upon like their arrest that these two kids cannot be around other children. They are dangerous. These two women are so convinced that this like 6-year-old and 8-year-old, or however old they are dangerous to themselves and other kids, and that they need to be punished in severe ways. Is there a chance where like someone who is accused of child abuse like this can kind of plead some mental illness type of way to get out of it?
Well, so let's talk about insanity, right? Insanity is a defense to criminal conduct, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of like intoxication, let's say, right? The kind of theory behind insanity is what I mentioned earlier, right? Mens rea. You have essentially some sort of defect in your brain, right? Or some sort of mental health issue that prevents you from meeting the mens rea, right? The intent standard, right? And therefore, you shouldn't be guilty, because if you can't meet that element, you can't be guilty of the crime. That's the theory. Now, in reality, it's very hard to prove insanity, right? The courts are designed to not let people do that easily for obvious reasons, right? And oftentimes, even if insanity is successfully argued and a jury returns a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, let's say, that doesn't mean that the party that has been acquitted, for example, goes free, right? There's institutionalized punishments, and there are other things that are oftentimes more severe and more lengthy than a traditional prison sentence. So the insanity defense is not something that could just be kind of thrown around lightly. That's not saying it won't be able to be used here. I don't know. But it's something that really needs to be dealt with seriously in the system.
So when prosecutors start their discovery and they start collecting evidence and building their story, is there any way that they can, I'm thinking back to this one clip, and maybe you've seen it, it's very popular, of Eve was one of the children who were found by police, and there were clips of like Ruby talking about how Eve forgot lunch at school and how she wasn't going to give her any food, and a lot of people were accusing Ruby of starving her daughter. Actually, they cease and desisted me, saying that, I was wrongfully accusing them of neglect, which, look at that in hindsight now. But do you think that they can use some of this online footage? And I know Insider did a report about, CPS coming into them. Can they use these things from the past to build a case that the abuse has been going on for years?
So again, right, the way that the trial will be designed to work is that what the courts want is for a jury to render a verdict based on what happened in this case. Now, that's not to say that other evidence can't be brought in, as long as it's brought in for a proper purpose, right? Like I said earlier, to show motive or intent, or to show, like I said, a pattern or a scheme. You can't just bring in evidence and show it to a jury and say, look at all these people, they're so bad, they're doing all these bad things. So even if what they're doing here isn't so bad, let's convict them anyway. That generally isn't supposed to happen.
And I guess when the process is that like evidence is submitted, and can't the defense and the judge, they both have to approve of that evidence being shown, correct?
Well, depends. The defense can consent to evidence, and then usually there's no issue. If the defense argues the admissibility of the evidence, the judge will have to decide, and then that's typically an issue that's preserved for appeal, and so on and so forth.
So we see a bunch of cases like, Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, and they're also public. Can this case be public because of the minor children involved? And do you think that there's any chance that there will be I can't imagine cameras in the courtroom, but could that happen?
It could. Obviously, the judge is in control of that. There are constitutional considerations as to the press and other things. But judges are typically in control of what happens. The judge can restrict camera access, and unless the press really wants to fight it, that's what will happen. And obviously, if the judge has considerations such as privacy considerations and protecting the children, then the judge will use that to prevent access to the public, cameras, and things of that nature.
So were you familiar with 8 Passengers before this case?
I was not.
Are you like, as someone just, kind of coming into the story and looking at their family and what's going on here, do you think it's like shocking? I mean, it's making headlines, I guess, for that reason.
I'm a lawyer. So number one, what's shocking to me isn't what's shocking to the general person. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah. But I also view it through the lens of the legal process. And I know not to bite when I see something in the press, particularly this early on. That's not to say that what's being alleged here isn't scary. The allegations are pretty scary. But I know how the process works. And I know how, as a case works its way through the system, sometimes it doesn't end the way that it is brought in the beginning. And so that's something to keep in mind. So no, it didn't shock me. I didn't. There are very few things, as I said, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that shock me when you read them,
You've seen a lot. So if they are, with these 2 charges that are being presented, if they are convicted on that, do you know what kind of punishment they would get? Would that be prison time?
Oh, that's impossible to answer for a variety of reasons. Number one of which, sentencing is a mitigation decision. right? Sentencing isn't only dependent on what the actual crime was. That's a factor, obviously. The nature of the offense is a factor. But it also depends on background and context and other evidence that will shape a judge's ability to properly sentence these folks, because the goal, more often than not, is to rehabilitate people when you punish them. And so all that has to be taken into consideration. It's entirely too early to have that discussion.
So, but I guess generally speaking, people do go to prison for child abuse. It's not going to be just like a $10,000 fee and then you walk away. I mean, we see people in jail for abusing children, right?
Well, child abuse is a very broad term. Certainly, there have been instances in the past where severe child abuse results in prison time, but that's upon a conviction. So let's see.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything else you'd like to add as far as like reviewing this case and just anything you see surprising, or are you going to be like keeping an eye on everything, I guess, in the system?
I'll be keeping an eye on things to a degree, and it'll just be interesting for folks to see how the process works if they're tracking it carefully. And everybody has lives and jobs, and that's not easy to do. But just keep an eye on how things work out, because maybe they'll work out as they are being presented now, and maybe they won't. And it's important for the public to get a glimpse of how the system works in that way.
Do you think so? If people are at home and they're so eager to know about this case and they don't want to wait for, the Insider NBC article, is there a certain place, like I guess the Utah court like website, like where would you get the quickest updates on this?
So again, I don't practice in Utah. Most cases are public record, but that doesn't mean that all parts of the case are public record, particularly in a case like this when children are involved. So the courts are your best option, and it's also the most reliable option, not the media, right? Because the courts will give you the evidence in the case and what's happening actually day to day. And so if people want to get into the case, I think that's one way to do it to the extent that you can, given the possible limitations.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Definitely go and check out Dmitri's YouTube channel linked below and go and see his other videos on commentary. And maybe you'll have an update on the passengers in a few weeks, because I am invested. But thank you for coming on, and we'll see you guys in a new video soon. Thank you again to Dmitriy for coming on to the channel. Definitely go and support his channel linked below. Go give him a subscribe, and I'll see you guys in a new video soon. Bye, guys.